We are going to myth number 6. I've heard this one a lot. There's actually a lot more than just this one on the table. It's a whole paradigm thing. But the KJV is a perfectly literal translation. Like, I know that there's no Bible out there that's perfectly literal, with the exception of maybe one of them fancy schmancy interlinear Bibles, but even they have to do a few things, right? First of all, what does it mean to be perfectly literal? And then why isn't the King James Version perfectly literal?
Man, those are two really big questions. That first one, especially the concept of literal translation. I'll put air quotes around it. Literal translation. It's a really slippery thing. And I think it mostly resides in the minds of people who don't know a whole lot about the original languages. And so in their mind, they think translation works kind of like, if you've ever seen that little kids game where you've got a whole bunch of different objects on two sides and you have to find the objects that match and draw a line between them. Like, here's the pear that matches the pear. Here's the apple that matches the apple. A lot of people think, I think naively, that that's how translation works, that you just take an original language text and the target language, you just draw a line and match up what's the one word that exactly matches this word in that language. Okay, that's done. What's the next word that originally matches perfectly in that language? And so they have this conception that when we talk about literal translation, that's what we mean. And when we talk about some other form of translation, sometimes called functional equivalence or dynamic equivalence, well, that's just a translator giving us his interpretation. I don't want interpretation. I want the quote unquote literal translation. That's really a misnomer. There is a spectrum of different ways that translators work. It's not like a sharp line where the US Bureau measure, what's that company called that does the Bureau and measure weights? There's an official company that says this is a pound and this is what a pound weighs. It's not like they have a copy of this is what literal translation is. Here's the perfect line. You're either literal or not literal. Every translation is interpretive. Every sentence that's translated is making some measure of interpretive decisions. Now, again, there's a spectrum. Translations can be more interpretive or less interpretive. They can be the formal words that are used sometimes is they can be more formally equivalent or more functionally equivalent, trying to keep as much as possible the form of the original words, or trying to keep as much as possible the meaning of the original words. And translations move all over in that spectrum. And any particular translation at different times moves between that spectrum. So in one verse, a passage in the King James might be much more literal, and in another passage, it might be much less literal. But that whole nebulous idea is really, in my opinion, kind of a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding of how translation works. I would say the King James Bible is certainly more quote unquote literal than most English translations. I think the translators were, as much as possible, trying to take the original Greek and Hebrew text and put them into English in as formally equivalent a way as possible. They were trying to match up words for words. They were trying to keep the form of the words the same as much as possible, but that doesn't mean they didn't make interpretive decisions. You can't, to give an example, I know you know as well, a Greek participle, you cannot translate a participle. They're all over the New Testament. You can't translate one without making some decisions that are interpretive.
That's right.
Different ways that it could be translated, and you've got to make a decision. They're like any other translators. They're making decisions. That's not a bad thing.
Like
it
idioms.
doesn't make a translation bad. Yeah, like idioms have to be translated.
God save the king.
Right? That's a good example.
God save the king. It's not literal to the translation, but it gets the idea across, right?
Exactly. And every translation does both in different places. They sketch in different passages more literal, less literal. So I would say generally the King James Bible is a very literal translation. It's more literal than most translations, but it's a myth to think that there's this one-for-one word correspondence. This kind of happens in the popular mind when people read the King James Bible and they see a word change somewhere else and they think, oh, well, that's not a literal translation. You've changed that word. The King James Bible is perfect. It's exact. They chose exactly the one and only word that could be used here, the one and only phrase that could translate this phrase. And that's just not the way translation works. It's also not the way the King James worked. And let me give one example of this. It's not the only part of this discussion, but one example of this would be the issue of what's called concordance. So when translators work, they translate certain Greek or Hebrew words into English words. Concordance is what happens when a translator says, as much as possible, I'm going to use the same English word to translate the same Greek word in every place. Now, that's obviously not always possible because words have a range of meaning. Any particular word can mean different things in different contexts. Take an English word like trunk. What does trunk mean? Well, you don't know until you have a context. It could be the back of a car. It could be a tree. It could be a body part of an elephant. It can mean a bunch of different things in different contexts. It doesn't have one meaning. But as much as possible, when a translator says, I want, wherever feasible, to translate the same Greek and Hebrew word with the same English word, that's what's known as concordance. Some translations today work very hard at that. The ESV is a good example. Leland Ryken was the head of the English literary portion of that committee. I forget what it was called. And he writes about the King James or about the ESV and points out how they were trying very consciously to keep concordance, to be consistent in how they rendered English words.
Right.
The King James translators, on the other hand, they lived in an age where that wasn't viewed as important and where it was kind of a literary fad of the time to use as many different words as possible to translate, bring out as many different meanings as might be there. And they explain in their preface, in Miles Smith's preface, he has a little section there under the heading, quote, reasons inducing us not to stand curiously upon an identity of phrasing. He explains that they took liberty with words. They didn't use a uniformity of phrasing or what he calls a, quote, identity of words. And they made what he says, quote, were verbal and unnecessary changings. So let me give you one or two quick examples of that. One example would be Romans 5:1-11. Alistair McGrath brings up this example, and I think it's a good one. In the Greek text, the same Greek word is translated 3 different ways in the course of that passage. The text in the King James talks about Christians rejoicing in hope, glory in tribulations, and joy in God. But all 3 of those English words that they've translated diversely are the exact same Greek word in Paul as he wrote it, and he means the same thing by them. And they've varied the way they translate it just for the sake of variety, for the sake of introducing variety. So they are intentionally not being concordant. Let me give you another example that David Norton talks about. We can see this also in the way that when we compare a gospel passage to its parallel passage, sometimes when the Greek is identical, the English in the KJV is different. And I list a bunch of those examples in that blog post about the not so exact King James Bible, which will probably link to that. But let me give you just one. If we compare Matthew chapter 6 and verse 28 to its parallel Luke chapter 12 and verse 27, we can see that sometimes those 2 texts differ because they're being very literal. For example, lilies of the field versus lilies, they're being exactly sticking very closely to the Greek there, and that's why that's different. But then in both of those passages, they use the same English word consider, but that's 2 different Greek words. So they're being less than concordant there in the way that they render that. And then in the last part of the sentence, most of it's exactly the same, but in this one instance, we see this memorable phrase from the King James, they toil not, neither do they spin. But in the other passage, it more accurately reflects the structure of the Greek. They toil not, they spin not. It's the same Greek text. They're rendering it 2 different ways just because of their variety that they take with words and the variety they take with phrasing. And the interesting thing is that the less literal form of that, they toil not, neither do they spin, is the one that has sort of stuck in our English consciousness.
That's right.
Quoted all the time because it has that more literary feel to it, rather. But anyway, we could produce thousands of examples.
I mean, the one that comes to mind right now is agape, right? It's charity in one place and love in another place. It's interesting because I did a little study on concordance, and I kind of came up with a sort of methodology to see if I could quickly determine how concordant is. It was more like a comparative scale. Like you wouldn't get an objective number, but you could say it's probably more concordant than this translation. And the King James version actually came out fairly concordant. It was probably one of the most concordant of them all based on the methodology. I can share with you that what I did later. But
that'd be fun. And I certainly don't mean to imply again that it's not a literal translation. They're certainly way more literal than most other translations and sticking very closely to the Greek and Hebrew, but we don't want to take that too far. Again, every myth has kind of a grain of truth to it. We don't want to push that too far to the idea that there's always an exact correspondence and a perfect choice in the King James that couldn't have been changed.
The only thing that throws off the concordance study is the NASB landed in a place that was totally unexpected. It ended up being very not concordant. So it might be an issue with the methodology, but everything else kind of fell as I had expected it. But I'll definitely have to refine that and take a look. But it's just interesting. I'd love to take a look at it.
It is interesting, and we should be clear. Concordance, this issue of concordance, is just one part of what it means to translate "quote unquote" literally. There's a lot of other things that go into it, but I think it's one part where we can clearly see the translators explaining that they weren't trying to be as literal as possible in this one particular area of translation.